So, when I initially wanted to launch the Architecting Through Life podcast about 10, 11 months back, I had recorded the first few episodes and literally before publishing, almost at the last minute, I turned back. I changed my mind about the whole thing and didn't publish anything. I recently went back to listen to one of the earlier episodes and I actually wanted to share what was the very first recording of the then Architecting Life podcast. So this was going to be the very first episode of the podcast, before obviously changing my mind and turning back from the whole thing. What's up, good people? My name is Simon, and thanks so much for joining us in the Architecting Life podcast, a podcast where we discuss various practical principles on how to build faith, character, and purpose. And I'm very, very excited for this very first episode. We officially did it. After a lot of long delays, I officially got going on this podcast, and I'm very, very excited. Got quite a few interesting topics lined up, but on today's episode, basically I'm looking at this idea of worldviews, and what I want to do in this first episode is lay the foundation on what this podcast is about, a bit about myself, and the direction we'll be taking as we go through this journey of the Architecting Life podcast. I will be posting a weekly episode, and each topic will be based on what I present in this episode of what glasses are you wearing. So maybe before we get into our podcast, maybe we just want to start with the story. So when I was about 10 years old, I had a lucky packet, and inside this lucky packet was a pair of green plastic glasses. And these green plastic glasses, when I wore them, as you can imagine, they made everything that I looked at appear as green. When I looked at the sky, it was green. When I looked at the clouds and the things around me, everything was green because of the glasses I was wearing. And even when I took the glasses off, after I blinked, there would still be a sense of green tint that would still be in my sight after I blinked. And that experience goes to illustrate something which is quite simple, but it's still profound when you think about it, that the world we see around us and how we experience it is very heavily influenced by the glasses we wear when we look. Those glasses that we wear is something that could otherwise be called a worldview. Or a paradigm or a perspective. And in simple terms, a worldview is basically the lens or the glasses you wear when you look at the world, And every single person has a worldview. Every single person has a specific lens or framework with which they see and look at the world around them. And that paradigm or that perspective shapes and influences the experience of the world. So what we experience of the world is heavily influenced by the lens or the glasses we wear when we look at the world, and that's what we call a worldview. Now, basically, a worldview is shaped or defined by a set of assumptions and answers that people have to four major questions, and that's the question of where we come from, the question of why we're here, the question of how do we know what's right now that we're here, and when the show is all over, where will we end up? Those four major questions, the answers we have or the assumptions we have about those four questions, those shape and define our worldviews. So every individual's worldview is built up by the assumptions and answers they have to the question of where they come from, why they're here, how do we know what's right and wrong now that we're here, and when the show is all over, where will we end up? And that's the question of destiny. And that basically shapes a worldview. And what I basically want to do in this channel will be framed based on my own worldview, I guess. And I'll be unpacking each of those questions as we continue throughout each episode and various other topics. But I want you to understand that that's basically what frames a person's worldview. And your picture of the world and mine is shaped by the answers that we have to those four major questions. Look at the world around us. And now, the answers that we get to these four questions come from different places, They come from a person's belief, a person's background, a person's culture, and a person's upbringing. But ultimately, all of these factors contribute towards answering those four questions. So how you know what's right and wrong can be influenced by your culture, by your upbringing, and by your background and whatnot. And all these various factors of life, various experiences, various teachings, faiths, beliefs, all contribute towards ultimately giving answers and assumptions towards the four questions of origins, where I come from, why am I here, how do I know what's right and wrong, and destiny. And that's what shapes a person's worldview. Now, it may be important to note that Just by virtue of the fact that we all have a worldview doesn't necessarily mean that every worldview has a correct set of answers to those 4 questions. Just because everyone has a set of glasses with which they see the world doesn't necessarily mean that the glasses they're wearing are giving an accurate picture of the world. Because the answers that come to those 4 questions have to be truthful and they have to be coherent. That means they need to make sense as well as correspond to reality, and that's basically what truth is. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. So when you look at what you believe about the world, what you understand about the world around you, it's shaped by the answers you have to those 4 questions. And those answers come from various places, whether it's your religion, your belief, your culture, your background. Various experiences you go through go towards answering and defining what your worldview is. So that's just something that I hope will guide and frame how we're going to look at the various recordings that we're going to go to on our podcast. But maybe a bit about myself and the classes that I'm wearing as we go through the Architecting Life podcast. I'm from a town called Boksburg in the eastern end of Gauteng, Johannesburg, a province in South Africa. I am an architect. I practice as an architect in the biggest architectural firm in Africa. I studied as an architect. I studied architecture, and that's what I've been practicing for the past few short years. So that's architectural lens and perspective has shaped a lot about how I view the world. I also write and speak here and there. I've been fortunate enough to author a book called Communion with Christ, a handbook on how to abide in Him. And that's basically really all it's about. It's a handbook on how to abide in Him. And I'm also involved in 1 or 2 other initiatives. I am fortunate enough to be in a youth-led non-profit company which basically focuses on church planting and youth development, as well as another publishing gig that I've been working on. So those are a few experiences that are about me, and I'll be sharing a bit about those experiences as I go through each and every episode. But the 3 major things that have affected my worldview, the 3 major things that I'd say have shaped the glasses I wear as I look at the world and as I go through the Architecting Life podcast is basically, number 1, my Christian faith. Gordon MacDonald defines a Christian as a Jesus follower, and I believe myself to be a follower of Christ, and that's a Christian. I believe that the Bible is a credible source of truth and information, not just information about the big questions of life, but practical information, about relationships, about marriage, about career development, about character development. As a Christian, I believe that the Bible holds a credible set of answers to those major questions of life. Secondly, I am also an architect. So as I said earlier, I work as an architect, and architecture is a very interesting field because it's both very creative as well as very technical. And the very definition of architecture is that it's both the process and the product of designing and constructing buildings or any other structures. So architecture is both a way of doing things, it's a process, as well as the product, whether it's a building or construction or another structure. So that way of thinking, the architectural lens of looking at the world, of problem solving, is something that's heavily influenced the glasses I wear when I look at the world. And the third is something that I'll call systems thinking. And it's basically understanding that the world operates as a set of various things that work together as a whole. And that's ultimately what a system is, and maybe I'll do an episode on that. But a system is a set of parts that work together as a whole. And systems thinking is basically an understanding of the relationships between the various things that exist in the world. It's got a unique ability to recognize complexity in simple things, but also the ability to simplify what otherwise seems like complex things. And that's something that, I've come to grow in. The Bible might call that discernment, I guess, but it's one of the 3 major factors that have heavily shaped how I look at the world. My Christian faith, my worldview as an architect, or understanding the world through the lens of architecture, as well as systems thinking. So those 3 things have really affected my worldview, and I look forward to discussing various topics through those various different lenses. I'm looking forward to some of the topics we've already got lined up, such as what is faith, what is culture. I've discussed briefly on what is a worldview, as well as other interesting things which affect both spirituality, faith, culture, devotion. And I'll be sharing these things as I learn on my personal journey of growth, building character, building purpose, as well as my growth in building a career path, in growth in work, in enterprise, and in business. So I'm really looking forward to the Architecting Life podcast, and as I build in my journey of faith, character, and purpose, I look forward to sharing the things that I learned along the journey, hoping that it'll benefit and help someone else along the journey. So when we look at a recap on what a worldview is, a worldview is nothing other than the glasses that you wear when you look at the world, and those glasses are informed by your answers to the big questions of life: where we come from, why we're here. Now that we're here, how do we know what's right and wrong? And ultimately, when the show is over, where will we all end up? Look forward to joining on the journey, and make sure that you do follow, bookmark, add a notification, subscribe to whatever platform you'll be listening to this. I'm looking forward to journeying with you on the Architecting Life podcast. My name is Simon. See you on the other side. Thank you for listening to the episode that you've just heard on the Architecting Through Life podcast. If you found it valuable, please kindly do me the favor of sharing it and maybe leaving a comment if you'd like. I'd really like to get your thoughts, any impact that you might feel it may have, and do feel free to share it with someone else so that it can be a benefit to them as well. Thank you so much for your time, and do join us again on the next episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast.